Welcome back to the second half of this lecture video. Now we're going to talk about non-deductive arguments. All right, so non-deductive arguments. All right, so as you're going to see shortly, there's a little bit less certainty involved with the things that we can learn from non-deductive arguments. So a basic definition of non-deductive arguments is that if the premises are true, then it is unlikely that the conclusion is false. So if you remember from deductive argument, when we were talking about deductive arguments, the truth of the premises guaranteed the truth of the conclusion, right? So in non-deductive arguments, we have varying degrees of essentially certainty that we can have in if it's the case that the premises are true. There are varying degrees of us feeling, pretty likely, very likely, very, 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 very likely that the conclusion is also true. But I think that probably looking at this slide, thinking it through, there's no absolute guaranteed truth of the conclusion just because the premises are true. So one thing that I do want to mention just quickly about the terminology is that there are several kinds of non-deductive arguments. And oftentimes, courses on critical reasoning would teach you about deductive arguments and what's often referred to as inductive arguments. So, ideally, nobody's poking around on the internet trying to figure things out because I'm framing this in a semi-unique sort of way, mainly because we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details of what inductive arguments are and also what abductive arguments are. The main thing that we want to focus on is this difference between arguments that guarantee the truth of the premises, guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and arguments where essentially the premises function as very good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. And for the most part, it's these kinds of arguments more broadly. We don't need to, again, get into the nitty-gritty details of like what the difference between, say, an inductive or abductive argument is, but just these arguments in general that involve us pointing to evidence to say, I think that this thing, X is very likely true. Those are the arguments that we actually make all the time, day-to-day basis, down to, guessing at roughly what time we need to leave our house, say, in order to get to work or class on time, right? Like oftentimes we appeal to, our experiences in the past, right? We appeal to what the train schedule says. And just based off of this is how long it takes me to walk from point A to point B, right? And all of that information is information that we gather roughly from past experiences. And we use that information to project into the future, say how long it's going to take us to get to our house, from our house to work. But we can't know with absolute certainty, right? We can appeal to those past experiences to say, yeah, I think it's very, very likely, very, 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 very likely if I give myself an hour and a half to get from my house to Lehman College, that I will get there on time. Some of you that might be, I'm guessing, probably a little bit of a shorter commute if you're going all the way to Lehman, but you get the general idea where there are things that could come up on your route that you couldn't possibly expect. So just because, you had all of these true, real experiences, I've done this 1,000 times. I checked the train schedule, there's no MTA like warnings about delayed trains. I've walked this like 1,000 times, and I can say with absolute certainty that like I would get to from my house to Lehman College in an hour and a half. That feels like you could get there with like absolute certainty, but as we all know, stuff can pop up in the way. You can't ever fully with 100% certainty make guesses about what's going to happen in the future, right? There's something that could come up. Something could happen on the train that I'm on my way to Lehman. I might get a phone call where I have to stop and talk. Say like a family emergency or something like this. We could also imagine, like worse, scarier reasons why, it might end up taking you longer to get to Lehman College. The main point there is, though, that we use arguments all the time, whether or not we realize it, in making projections about what's going to happen next, in making projections about how long it's going to take us to make dinner, what our family might want to eat, whether or not you need to go to the grocery store and trying to remember all of the stuff that you have in your fridge. The assumption that you will be making dinner that night, right? All of those things are projections into the future. So even if we appeal to our past experiences and things that we can know, like within the premises with absolute certainty, because it's in the future and it hasn't happened yet, we don't have the truth of those premises, cannot guarantee that the conclusion is true, like we saw in deductive arguments. Okay, so that's kind of the basic thinking, conceptual framework behind non-deductive arguments. And when we're evaluating arguments like these, we are going to be using different terminology than what we used when we were learning about how to evaluate deductive arguments. So when we're talking about non-deductive arguments, and we're taking that first step in assessing, doing that hypothetical step of like, all right, if it's the case that these premises are true, is it likely the conclusion would also be true? Remember how we're that hypothetical? If we don't have to go to the real world fact check yet. Let's just say for the sake of argument, right? Like that's where that phrase comes from. For the sake of just the argument itself, if these premises were true, would that make it very likely that the conclusion is also true? In other words, do the premises provide adequate support or reason to believe what the person is saying in the conclusion of the argument? And when we check mark that and we say, yeah, that's good, like the premises, if all this stuff was true, if all of these reasons were true, like imagine like, all right, I checked the train. There's no delayed, the trains that I take, none of them are delayed. I've done this trip 1,000 times and it's never taken more than an hour and a half. I know exactly how fast I need to walk, all of those premises. So if all of that's true, does that give sufficient good reason to believe, yes, it'll take me an hour and a half to get from my house to Lehman College, right? So when we say yes, it does, we say that non-deductive argument is strong. And we use the word strong here because strength comes in varying degrees, right? Like you could look at all of the premises and think, well, actually maybe there's some information missing here. Like, say that that the app, like the MTA app, like isn't being good about updating lately, right? Like there's all of these train delays and the app's not telling you about it. Like you could say, all right, well, it could be true that there's no delays according to the MTA app, but it's been like funky and bad lately. So I'm not really like, we have some pretty good, like we might say like a mildly strong argument at that point. All of my past experiences plus, the MTA app says that there's no trains with delays. None of the trains that I take are delayed. And we said, yeah, like we trust that, like, I know, how fast it's going to take me to walk there and all of that sort of thing. So in that case, when we have like one bit of evidence where it's like, yeah, it's true, but yeah, that app kind of sucks, right? then maybe we wouldn't say we have a strong non-deductive argument, but we would say that we have a maybe mildly strong, right? You can sort of hedge it. You can think of it in terms of varying degrees. It gives you a little more leeway versus what we were looking at with deductive arguments when we were saying, it's like it's either valid or it's not valid. It's black or white. There's a lot of gray area space that you can operate within when you're judging the strength of a non-deductive argument. So after we've decided, like, okay, I've gone through and we pass go, right? We collect $200. Like, it's at least a mildly strong, semi-strong, non-deductive argument. Like, okay, yeah, like these premises, they provide decent support for the truth of the conclusion. Then, and only then, right, would we evaluate whether or not the argument is cogent. So I just want to reiterate that. So like we talked about with non-deductive, or like we talked about with deductive arguments, if we determine that the argument's an invalid argument, we, do not pass go, do not collect $200. I apologize to anyone who's never played Monopoly, but like full stop, no more evaluation, like big red stop sign, don't go any further. It's only after we say check mark, yes, this is a valid argument, that we then check to see whether the premises were actually true when we're talking about deductive arguments, right? And we would evaluate for soundness. So sort of similarly, it's just different terminology since these are two obviously very different kinds of arguments. When we're evaluating non-deductive arguments, after and only after we determine that an argument is strong, decently strong, then we evaluate whether or not the argument is cogent. Now here, when we're evaluating for cogency, what we are looking at is whether it is both strong and the premises are true. So here, this is where we go in and we do some fact checking. It's relatively straightforward, right? Like this is something that we can, Google can be an especially helpful tool for us when we're going in and wanting to like fact check to see whether certain reasons that someone gives that are supposedly backing up their argument, right? To see whether those reasons are true, to see whether those propositions, you remember those claims about facts of the matter, are actually true propositions. They tell us something that is true of the real world. Okay. So now what we want to do is practice a little bit, just like we did last time with non-deductive arguments, or like we did last time with deductive arguments. All right. So here, we want to ask ourselves two questions. If the premises were true, is it likely that the conclusion could be false, right? So it might sound a little weird. So what there we're sort of positing is like, okay, could we imagine a scenario where we have, the list, the like 1, 2, say on the first top of the practice argument number 1. We say 1 and 2. If 1 and 2 were true, would that make it very unlikely that the conclusion is false? So instead of saying, this hypothetical of does it guarantee, it's just like thinking about, would this give us like strong, good indication, the truth of those premises, give us good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. All right, so let's take a look at practice question number 1, and then we'll take a look at the second question. All right. The Career Center at the college is giving a week-long seminar on how to build a good resume. Gina is a student at the college looking to strengthen her resume. Therefore, Gina can likely get some free help with her resume. So if you remember last time when I was talking about how, and I would imagine every single one of you in this class can point to an experience where it seemed like there was some great deal being offered to you, and then when you looked at like the fine print, you realized that like, no, actually you're not eligible for this offer. Like, essentially anytime you go to like a website to buy clothes or something like this and it's like 10% off the entire store, just enter coupon code da 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 da, and then like you put a bunch of stuff in your cart and then you go to check out and lo and behold, like that discount only applied to like half of the items, right? And it was all in the fine print, that sort of thing. So like even when we're like presented, definitely surefire, if like you're shopping at this store, every single item in the store is going to be 10% off. You just have to enter this coupon code. We all know that because of that kind of fine print sneaky behavior with stores, that it's not that you can guarantee that you're going to get 10% off everything in your cart. It's more that it's just kind of likely that you're going to get 10% off, hopefully, everything in your cart, right? And so it's like a similar story with Gina at the college, right? Like she sees this thing about a week-long seminar on how to build a good resume, right? Maybe there's no information on the flyer about the costs of the seminar. But it is something that's directed at college students. And say in the past, this is the tutoring center at the college has put on these things, and in the past, like they've done like hundreds of them and they've never charged anybody who's a student, has never had to pay for it, right? So we have all of those details there in mind and thinking, okay, all right, so if all that stuff were true, then would it make it likely that Gina could get some free help on her resume, right? So the argument that I just explained, right, included this premise of, referencing in the past the tutoring center putting on these week-long seminars on resume building, right? Like have never ever charged for it. If we take this argument as it is, if we take the argument as it's written up on the PowerPoint slide there, right, that kind of notches it down a little bit, right? Like, has the university ever done anything like this? Like, which program's putting it on, is this actually like some private company that is offering this through the school at like a discount, right? Like we're familiar with this. We see this sort of thing all of the time. Okay, so if we just see the argument up at the top there, the idea that Gina, we might think it's very likely Gina could get some help with her resume, but we might be a little less convinced, right, that she's going to get free help with her resume. So really depending on the circumstances, like with an argument like this one here, you could say mildly strong, right? Like it gives like, let's assume that we're actually talking about Lehman College that really like very rarely does charge students for these kinds of services. And based off of what we know about the college, Gina being a student, what we know about kind of like say how the tutoring center does these things in general, we might say, like I think it's pretty likely, right? It seems like a relatively strong argument. Now if you say went to like a private college where there were things like this that often students did have to pay for, you might think it's like actually a pretty weak argument. Like you'd have to know more. You'd need to be given more reason to think that Gina would actually, the help that she would get from the seminar would be free help, right? And so that's why, when we're talking about strength and we're looking at, whether these premises provide adequate support to believe the conclusion is likely true, it's really, really useful to have this idea of strength and thinking of it in varying degrees, right? And it's also really important to think about when we're evaluating an argument's strength, what information might be missing, whether or not the argument does provide adequate support for the conclusion. If we take this argument at face value, where, there's absolutely no information about this help being free, it's, pretty reasonable to think like maybe this doesn't, I need more information about, how free these kinds of seminars normally are before I can actually make a judgment here. Until that point, I'm sorry, like this is a pretty weak argument. Like yeah, I think it's likely Gina might be able to get some help, but free, like that's another story. I need more information. I need more reasons, right? I need another premise in the argument to really assure me that this free bit is likely. Okay. All right. So that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about strength. And that's, I think that probably it's pretty clear now, like how different deductive and non-deductive arguments are, because we have all of this like stretchy area. There's all this gray area that we could sort of exist in determining varying degrees of strength in an argument. Okay. So now let's assume that we say, let's assume that we're talking about Lehman and we just like, no, there's some implied premises here, perhaps. And this is, we think that this practice number one, this practice argument number one is like a pretty strong, decently strong argument. Okay. So then from there, what we want to do is ask whether the premises promotes a high degree of belief in the conclusion, right? That is from there, or let me actually reframe that. That phrasing might be a little bit not specific enough. From there, what we want to do is we want to look at whether or not the premises are actually true. So like step one, we do the hypothetical, right? We go, if all this stuff were true, does that give us good reason? And then we ask, okay, is this stuff true? All right, as long as we like check mark, okay, at least like it meets like a decent degree of strength, like it has a decent degree of strength to it, then we can like go and evaluate. And the reason why we want to do that is because if it's the case that we're like, oh yeah, all this stuff could be true and the conclusion could still be false, right? Like, what's the point of looking at this argument anymore? Like, I need more evidence in the argument. Like, that's why you don't pass go, you don't collect $200, you stop your evaluation. Because really, if an argument isn't at least like decently strong, mildly strong, it's not really worth your time to go in and fact check something that's not giving you adequate reason to believe the main take home point, the conclusion, right? Okay. So this argument might be a little bit more plausible. I think it depends. There's going to be like a lot of much more range because we have all that stretchy room with like these different degrees of strength. There's a lot more space really for students to, in like this class, to come to different judgments on the arguments that we're looking at, So yeah, I guess one thing that is important to bear in mind there is while you're working on the practice sheet and and then later on the module worksheet, really having your own good reasons, your own good arguments for giving the answers that you give, because sometimes students sort of analyze and evaluate some arguments like that in ways that they actually come up with like pretty different answers, but that doesn't stop me from giving full credit to both students, provided that they kind of like explain their reasons behind it. And all right. So let's take a look at practice question, or the practice argument number 2. All right, like let's do the 2-step process. We're going to evaluate for strength, and then if we pass the strength test, we're going to move on to evaluate for cogency. All right. Okay, so premise 1, most humans experience heartbreak at some point in their lives, right? Not necessarily romantic heartbreak either. Like it could be, heartbreak over not having some form of like success, heartbreak and losing like family, that sort of thing. So yeah, so keeping in mind a very broad sense of like what heartbreak could amount to. So most humans experience that broad thing. Let's say like the writer of this book is a human, or we can say, I'm a human. Therefore, it is likely that they have or will experience heartbreak at some point in their life, right? So as long the idea there is like, all right, we've got this general category, like most humans experience heartbreak at some point in their life. That person is a human. Therefore, it is likely that they have or will experience heartbreak, right? And an important thing to keep in mind with this argument is it's not saying all humans experience heartbreak. It's just most, right? So, right off the bat, the argument acknowledges that it could be true. Most humans experience heartbreak at some point in their lives, and that, like, this person, that person is a human, right? Both of those things can be true. And all that tells us is it's likely that that person or this person will or has experienced heartbreak at some point. It doesn't guarantee it because it's just most people, they're exceptions, right? Okay, so that's the idea of the argument. Now let's think about if these premises were true, would it make it unlikely that the conclusion is false, right? So there's going to be some double negatives in what I'm about to say. So bear with me. If it sounds confusing the first time around, I will try to explain it in a different way. All right. So imagining it's the case, most humans in existence, that have existed, currently exist, like experience heartbreak at some point in their lives. All right. And then we pick out one individual of the, like, we're like, of this, sea of people, like we pick out one, like this one, that one, that one. Okay. So imagine both of those things are true. Does it make it unlikely that that person or this person is not? Does it make it unlikely that the person, like, let's say me, let's say I am a human. Does it make it unlikely that it is false that I am likely? Rather, let me try this one more time. I think probably most of you are getting the idea here. Essentially, let's just imagine the first two premises are true. And then can we think of a reason to believe that it's not likely or unlikely that, this random sampling will not or has not experienced some kind of heartbreak, right? Hopefully the conclusion that you're drawing there is your own conclusion, is that yeah, the argument's pretty strong. Again, it might depend a little bit on context, like specifically which person you're pointing to. Could it be like some kind of like fictional character, like a cartoon character or something like this, where like you're like, that's actually like not I need a different definition of, say, like what a human is, if like this cartoon character counts as a human, for instance. But setting aside those kind of more like wilder possibilities, if you just think of maybe like if you live in an apartment building, like the people in your building, or if you work in some kind of like on your block, like all the people on your block, if you just like randomly picked one of those people, right? If it were true that most people experience heartbreak, the way that like most and majorities work, like it's more likely if you picked out a random sample of all of this group of humans, right? That one, really, as long as there's like it's more than 50%, because that's most, then it's likely that it's more likely that you're going to pick someone who's experienced heartbreak than it is that you wouldn't, essentially. Okay, so the argument is strong. Great. Pass, go, collect $100, $200, whatever. I can't remember what the rule was. And now we want to think about whether those premises are actually true, right? And here, this is where people can draw up like majorly different conclusions about things, in large part because there's different ways that people define heartbreak, right? And then kind of if like you include cartoon characters and what counts as a human, there's going to be need to explain a little bit more information there. But all of a sudden this like majority might be diluted a little bit if things that the person making this argument is assuming about humans, what counts as a human, are not things that that you assume or you believe, right? So that is where you really start to develop and make your own arguments when you're analyzing other arguments, because you're saying, hey, I disagree with what this idea of heartbreak is. I think heartbreak is this much narrower definition, and it's actually not something that most people experience. Or according to my definition of human, like this includes a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually experience heartbreak. So now we're not at 50% anymore. We're actually at something lower, right? And in giving that and thinking through that stuff, what you're doing is you're developing reasons for rejecting the conclusion of this argument and saying, like, here are my reasons for thinking these premises in this argument are problematic. Therefore, I think that the conclusion is likely false. Okay. Okay. So, pretty much the last thing that I want to talk about with non-deductive arguments is the upside and the downside. So the upside, and I was kind of alluding to this in the very beginning of the video, is that it allows us to learn new things, form new beliefs. If you remember, in deductive arguments, the truth of the premise or the truth of the conclusion was kind of implicit. It was like snuck in to the truth of the premises. It was just like something, it was like just a kind of a logical consequence of something that was already established as true within the premises. And non-deductive arguments allow us to make projections, right? You remember also, like I was talking about in the beginning, how this is the day-to-day, this is the arguments, not these it logically follows kind of arguments that we make. Sometimes people describe what they're doing in that way, but more often than not, we're making inferences about things that we don't know with absolute certainty, or the premises of our arguments are not actually, they just give us perhaps very good reason to think that our conclusion is true, but most certainly don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It's going to take me an hour and a half to get from my house to Lehman College. A lot of the arguments that we make are based on things that happen in our past experiences, and then we project out, we project forward, we make guesses about what's going to happen in the future, or we, perhaps look to certain agreements that we came to with people, commitments that we made, responsibilities that we have, and think about, based on those agreements, responsibilities, commitments, what that other person could reasonably expect from us. The truth of those commitments, those responsibilities, that sort of thing, doesn't entail or guarantee that, say, this person should have reasonably expected you to think that you would have come by your house and walked your dog at that specific time, depending on the nature of the agreement, right? It doesn't, if you say you kind of come to an informal arrangement for childcare or pet care with a neighbor or something like this, and it feels very set in stone with you, and there's some compensation, but there's no contract, right? If they don't do something that you expect, maybe they skip a day without telling you, and you're like, well, we had this agreement. And they said, no, this was you were just gonna I was just knocking at your door around the same time every day to see if you wanted me to like watch your kids for a second or take the dog out or whatever, right? This is a weird arrangement. I know, I'm just coming up with it off the top of my head. But in any case, like you get the sense where it's these like there's nothing written down on paper. And we have these agreements, and you might feel like, well, I mean, I've just been familiar with scenarios like these where like someone thinks like, okay, so according to this commitment that you made, this responsibility that you have for me to do this thing, the logical conclusion is that you should have come to my house at this time, or you should have told me that you weren't going to be around today or something like this. And the fact of the matter is, that's not a logical conclusion. It's not the premises, your reasons don't necessarily entail the truth of your conclusion. You should have expected that I would have wanted this sort of thing. It just makes it very, very, very likely. It's still very convincing. It's still very persuasive, but this is another reason why we really want to move away from this thinking, and that, logical deductive arguments are the arguments that somehow provide this like argumentative authority in these disagreements that we have. Like the logical person is like the right person to listen to, and this sort of thing. Yeah, logic is an important thing to pay attention to, but 99.9% of the times we're not making those kinds of arguments. We're making arguments that are based in inferences for the most part. Inferences about the future, inferences about what other people think. Those sorts of things are not things that are these sort of like have these entailment relations, these logical relations, because a lot of the time they hinge on things happening in the future. And a lot of like our social arrangements aren't ones that are like bound by the force of logic. It's possible for people to misunderstand things, forget about things, things like that. Not in the same way that like when you come up with a definition of what counts as a good artist, right? Like we were talking about in the Madonna example, right? Like according to my, that definition, which is for the record not my definition of what makes a great musician or a great artist. But like if it's popular for a long time, then that necessarily entails, that promises, guarantees that Madonna is like a truly great musician. So yeah, that's an important thing to sort of keep in mind when we're thinking about this contrast between deductive and non-deductive arguments. The non-deductive arguments are the ones that we really that are much more woven into the fabric of our day-to-day lives. And that's a really great thing because it's the only way that we can generate new beliefs about stuff. Remember, all this, the truth of those conclusions just in deductive arguments just fell out the truth of the premises. And we can build on new stuff. We can build on the stuff that we know to make projections, well-reasoned, well-defended guesses at what people are thinking and what's going to happen in the future. And it's that latter kind, those kinds of arguments that that allow us to form new beliefs, and they're the ones that we use most of the time. But this does require taking a sort of inductive leap or a non-deductive leap, right? Because we can't know it with absolute certainty. And again, that was like the appeal of the deductive arguments, right? Like, is that they guaranteed it. Here, we have to take a little bit of a leap. And how far we leap depends on the strength of the argument, right? Like, if you remember, when I was talking about Gina, if you took a little bit of a leap and you were like, all right, the college being referenced in this part of the argument is actually Lehman, and, based off of like my own experiences, these kinds of seminars are for the most part free. And then from that, you said, okay, this is like a pretty strong argument. I think this is a pretty strong argument. If you said, I don't know what college we're talking about here, right? I don't know what their history with like free is. Where does free come from? I don't see any of that in the premise, right? You're saying I'm not willing to take that leap. This is too far a leap for me, okay? So whether it's like a small leap or a bigger one, right? Like up until a certain point, we don't want to take a jump at all. It still requires making a little bit of a jump of faith. And that's because the way it works for any inductive, abductive, non-deductive argument, so the umbrella of non-deductive argument, it can be strong, but it is always the case that the premises could be true and the conclusion could still be false, right? Like something could happen on my train as I'm going to Lehman College, which prevents me from getting there in under an hour and a half. And that's why, whether or not it's written explicitly or it's implicit, for any non-deductive argument, all we can really say is that it's likely that, if we say like, if the premises are true, then it's likely that the conclusion would be true. We never say then it guarantees or the conclusion will necessarily be true or anything like that, like we can say about deductive arguments. Okay. So, yeah, actually, before we like dig into this, so yeah, don't, as best you can, don't take a look at it yet. One of the most important things that you're going to be doing when you're looking at inductive or non-deductive arguments is you're going to be considering, and this is obviously only after you've determined that the argument's strong enough, you're like willing to take that leap, essentially. Like the evidence given in the premise is, if they were true, hypothetically true, then you'd be willing to take that leap, okay? And believing the conclusion is also true. So after you've determined that you're willing to take that leap, the next step is going to be fact checking. And this is an important one. And don't be afraid to this is the place where I am totally fine with students using Google when you're evaluating whether or not arguments are cogent, non-deductive arguments are cogent. You're more than welcome to pop onto Google and fact check all of the arguments that you're evaluating. Like there's not a whole lot of hypothetical stuff going on. You can actually fact check it. And if you find that, there's some kind of misstatement or misrepresentation of the facts, right? Then what you're going to say is yep, well, I was willing to take that leap of faith. The argument's strong enough for me, but I fact checked this and it's not cogent. Okay. So, now we are going to take a look at one last little example. So, yeah, here we go. So let's think about, is it strong? Is it cogent? There's some reference to research here talking about staring at blue light. So staring at your laptop, your phone, TV, that it prohibits the production of melatonin. And it also shows that doing things like stuff you often do on your phone, on television, on your laptop, so video games, watching TV, work-related activities, those increase cortisol production. So, and cortisol is a stress hormone. And another study showed that individuals experiencing high stress who avoided sleep before bed sleep better than individuals experiencing less stress who did engage with screens before bed. So we have 3 different bodies of research here, essentially trying to draw out perhaps some of the consequences of messing around on your phone, your computer, TV before going to sleep, in your bed. So if all of these things were true, right, would you be willing to take that leap? Is that a strong enough argument for you, essentially? I'd like everybody to think about that. If you would like to send me an email telling me whether or not you think that the argument is strong, yes, you are willing to take that leap. And then if you want to do some fact checking and figure out whether or not, it's only if you think it's strong. Maybe you come up with something and you think, actually, I need more evidence here. I'm still not willing to take this leap, right? It's failing to consider something important. I think all of this stuff could be true, and the conclusion would nonetheless be false, right? Doesn't give me strong enough reason to believe the conclusion is actually true, right? So if you think that, don't pass go, don't collect $200, you're not willing to take the leap, full stop. But if you're like, yep, I'm willing to take the leap, then tell me whether or not you think it's cogent. That's where you do some of the fact checking, and a couple of sentences explaining, your reason, your own personal reasoning behind the judgments that you made about this article. So if you want to get this to me by the end of this module period, which would be Monday, you're welcome to do so. And you can just send that in via email. Be sure to include 5169 in the subject line though. Okay. That about does it that really does it for non-deductive and deductive arguments. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A forum on Blackboard or send me an email if you're confused about anything. And thanks everyone. And I'm looking forward to seeing how all of this reasoning shakes out on your upcoming assignments.